this is something that's really cool regarding the Holodomor. So there was one Western journalist, Gareth Jones, who was like, all right, something's not adding up here. So he was supposed to take a train through Ukraine, and he got out early and decided to start walking through the countryside to go from village to village. And I'll get to his story in a minute. Right before we started recording, I got this book in the mail. I ordered it on November 28th from Great Britain. It was the only copy available on the whole internet. It's called Experiences in Russia in 1931. It is anonymous, and it's Gareth Jones wrote the introduction. It was published by the Alton Press in Pittsburgh. It was self-published, and see, it just says forward. It just says by the author. So it was the author who went alongside Gareth Jones was someone by the name of Henry John Heinz, who was heir to the Heinz fortune. And you only know that if you start looking at the internet, because his name's not anywhere in this book. Well, I opened this book up right when I got it, right before we were taping, and it's signed by him. And it took me a second. I'm like, wait a minute, who's this signed by? And it's H.J. Heinz, because his name was Jack Heinz, but it was Henry John Heinz. So this is, I'm very excited that I had this little miracle in the mail. But
Christmas miracle.
It's a Christmas miracle.
They traveled together?
They traveled together. So this book's a diary of their travels.
Why do you think so few journalists
was
able to do what he did? So
there were several reasons. First of all, if you were a Western journalist in the Soviet Union, you were under very strict circumstances. First of all, you could be deported at any time. There was no pretense that you have a right to be a journalist in, especially as a representative of a capitalist, by which they meant Western paper. Second, it was a complete nightmare getting your articles filed, because you had a censor that you had to go through, and the censor's job, whose life depended on it, was to make sure that your story was advantageous to the Soviet Union, or at least neutral. And they had all sorts of techniques. They could they spied on you all the time. They followed you around because, you're a foreigner. But also that censor had to answer to somebody. So all the censor has to do is be like, look, I'm having trouble with my supervisor. And the reporter could be like, well, can I talk to the supervisor? It's like, well, I'm sorry, that's not possible. And he's on deadline, but it's too bad. Bureaucracy doesn't recognize the needs of deadlines. So there was a big pressure, a lot of pressure on Western journalists to have to get through this net. And that's literally constant. Every story, it's going to be a fight. So at a certain point, you're just going to be like, all right. And you're going to pre-censor yourself. If all right, if I include this, it's not going to get through. What are you supposed to do? I think human beings are naturally, and also a lot of these journalists were pro-Soviet. They thought this is the society of the future. At least everyone's trying to make it a better country for everyone, not like back home where the poor slip between the cracks. We got to do what we can to make this work. And, there was a lot of, I don't want to say conspiracy, but within the industry, there was a consensus that the Stalin was the good guy, and we were, if not the bad guys, certainly not as good in certain regards. So when this news of the famine started percolating, all the other Western journalists besides Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge were saying this isn't true. It's nothing that they haven't seen before. The paper that took the lead in this was the New York Times, with their guy Walter Duranty, who had previously won a Pulitzer and had interviewed Stalin, which was an enormously rare honor for a Westerner. And because he has so much experience covering Russia and the Soviet Union, he basically took the lead, and other people followed his lead. He was kind of the dean of the press corps in Russia. And he made a point. And the thing, there's so many quotes I have from him where he's not only denying that this mass starvation is happening, he's also going after journalists who are questioning the narrative. And he says things like, look, this is nothing that the Russians haven't experienced before. They're simply tightening their belts. And it's like, you only have to tighten your belt when you don't have enough food. It's not like they started a new exercise regimen and now their body fat's dropping. Why would someone tighten their belt? So that was one. And the New York Times had a 13-page article, big headline: Russians hungry, not starving. And he went after Jones. He went after Muggeridge, I believe. No, he did go after Muggeridge. But the point being that this is just propaganda from people who want the Soviet Union to fail. They don't understand what they're building here. He had so many excuses like, oh, the reason all these Russians are supposedly leaving their villages to go to the cities isn't because there's no food. It's because they're nomadic. It's tradition. They go from town to town looking for new experiences. And it's just, at a certain point, and I think it was 1941, where he was eventually like, or 51 rather, I don't remember. He was like, oh, well, I guess I was kind of wrong. And it's like, he's like, any journalist worth his salt can admit when he's wrong. And it's like, well, were you worth your salt? Because he explicitly said there's no point in sending out journalists to look for themselves. I've been through the countryside and everyone's fine. And it's just that the loudest people are making noise, whereas everyone else is doing the work and trying to, and this isn't about famine, but it's about Westerners skeptical about collectivization, which is just simply a new way of farming. And yeah, it was a new way of farming, and the results were by design and also accidentally absolutely catastrophic.
How hard was it to see the truth at that time, do you think? Do you think that was a mistake that's understandable to make as a journalist?
If my job as a journalist, I have two bosses if I'm in Moscow. I've got my reporter in New York or London or whatever, but I've got my censor here. And he is making sure I have a house, an apartment.
Yeah.
He makes sure I have food. He makes sure I have access to dignitaries. He's my lifeline. If I piss him off, I'm on the next plane out of town. So
is that enough? Is that enough to slowly suffocate the integrity of a journalist?
I don't think it was slow at all, and it was clearly enough. And because what are they going to do?
I disagree with that. I disagree. I think the failure of integrity has to come from the New York on the American side. That it's just the flock of fish or whatever that all move in the same narrative.
Right.
I think journalists would like to be the kind of people that have integrity. So if they are conscious of sacrificing their own integrity, they wouldn't do it. If they're conscious of an act that's doing it, they wouldn't do it. So it has to happen like a lobster slowly boiling.
No, I think it happens when everyone else is. It's a Greek chorus, right?
Right. It's a chorus, but that's right. So it's not about the act, but they will. I mean, I've talked to journalists where I get the sense that they will sell their soul for access.
Because that's their job.
Is it though? Because what journalists do, I've seen American journalists, they take a huge amount of pride for having gotten the interview, whatever that is, the Putin interview. And first of all, they're glowing with pride. It seems like they're always showing off to the other journalists back in America. So they're glowing up, like showing off, like, look, I got the access you didn't. And second thing they're doing when they show up to that interview is they ask all the questions that signal to the other journalists that we're on the same side. They ask the most generic, aggressive questions to which they know the answers. They want to basically get the access and ask the quote unquote hard hitting questions that they know will not be answered. And this is the entire machinery of it. That's modern journalism. And I suppose at that time
it was worse.
They weren't even doing the hard hitting, the display of hard hitting questions.
Right. Because
it was PR pieces.
Think about what high status that is. If I'm an American journalist in Moscow, I'm allowed in this secretive country. I'm the guy who's very privileged to have access to live in Moscow and tell Americans, which are all fascinated about this new society of the future, what it's like. And as soon as I kind of start questioning the narrative, I'm going to get kicked out and humiliated very publicly. Well, I thought you were in Moscow. What am I supposed to say? So, Eugene Lyons was, he's one of the heroes in the book. He was a young communist, and I think it was United Press he was working for. They sent him there. And when he went there, he's like, "Oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be like. This is horrible." And he turned very heavily against it. But he talks about how they would write one thing and say another thing and then think another thing. And each of those steps was just more and more like kind of lying in terms of maintaining your sanity and maintaining your narrative.